Greetings. This is the John Savers Variety Spotlight Show. My name is John Savers. I'm your host. Today we will feature an interesting program calculated to interest, amuse, edify, and in all ways improve the people of Northern Virginia. So on that note, let us go forth. On this particular show, I have no active role other than introducing the program. And so on that note, let's take it away.
To understand Mideast newspaper headlines, you have to know about the background, the foundation, which the headlines are based upon. What are these headlines about? They're about the Palestinians, Israel, Iraq. To understand Israel, you have to know something about the Holocaust. That's essential for understanding Israel and the special relationship Israel has with the United States. We could learn about the Holocaust through TV shows, books, newspapers. But look at the quality of the newspaper. Here's a Mideast headline in the San Francisco Chronicle: Israel storms Arafat headquarters. But with so many important things happening in the world, look what the editor chose for the top story of the day. A cheesy humor piece. Son puts mom up for sale on eBay. So let's not use newspapers or TV programs. Instead, let's learn about the Holocaust by getting a book written by a professor. The standard work on the Holocaust is The Destruction of the European Jews by Professor Raoul Hilberg. It comes in 3 volumes. To the right is the condensed version for students. We'll be using the 3-volume version, published in 1985. Here's Raoul Hilberg from the movie Shoah, directed by Claude Lanzmann.
In all of my work, I have never begun by asking the big questions because I was always afraid that I would come up with small answers, and I have preferred, therefore, to address these things which are minutiae or detail in order that I might then be able to put together in a gestalt a picture which, if not an explanation, is at least a description, a more full description of what transpired.
On page 1219, there is a table showing the number of deaths broken down into categories. Hilberg put the total Holocaust deaths at 5.1 million. I know you've heard the 6 million number, but Hilberg, having researched the subject for 40 years at the time the book came out, arrived at an estimate of 5.1 million. Hilberg gives a breakdown of the deaths that occurred at the camps. Here we can see that 1 million deaths occurred at Auschwitz. The next 3 camps, Treblinka, Belsec, and Sobibor, are thought of as their own separate category because they were run so similarly. They are sometimes called the Operation Reinhardt death camps. Together they equal more deaths than Auschwitz, 1.5 million. These 3 camps equal a little under 1/3 of the Holocaust, and it's these 3 camps that we're going to be looking at for the rest of this video. The Operation Reinhardt death camps worked like this. Jews were ordered onto trains. Some were told they were being shipped east, where they would find work. At a point in the journey, they were told that everyone needed to get off at the next stop to transfer to a different train. And due to a typhus epidemic spread by lice, they would also shower and be deloused here. The passengers would step out of the train into a narrow passageway between the train and this building right here and walk to the left. There were fake signs to make them think they were at a real train station. That white thing there at the end of the building is actually this sign here. Notice the people on the left who have just passed the corner of the building. You'll be able to see them in the distance in the next image. They would gather in a group in this area and then be led through this gate where you see the red arrow. That same gate is in the lower right of this aerial photo. The men would go to their right and the women into the building on their left, where they would check in their belongings and strip naked for what they were told would be a shower. The men would walk in this direction to join the women at the entrance to a dirt path known as the tube, a path that led to the gas chamber. This red arrow here is in the same place as this red pointer in this aerial view. Entering this path, they'd walk down here, the path taking them around these trees to the entrance of the diesel gas chambers. Sobibor, Belsec, and Treblinka were all run like this. Let's look at a map rather than a model. The main train track line was right here. The train to Treblinka would pull in onto these rails, and the people would get out right here. They would walk along here. That sign I pointed out would have been about right here on the map. So they'd come into this area, this courtyard, and then they would walk through this gate in the fence. The men would come over here, check in their belongings, and strip naked. And the women would go over here and check in their belongings and strip naked. Then they would enter what was called the tube right here. This was the pathway to the gas chamber. Here's a model of the Belsec gas chamber sitting on a wood table. Inside there are 6 chambers, each about the size of a small bedroom. Here's one of the 6. You can see a man inside working on removing the dead bodies. A hallway runs down the middle. A room in the very back contained a diesel engine which pumped exhaust into the rooms. You can see the door of that room here. From this view you can see when the gassing was finished, these doors opened upward, similar to garage doors. Here's one of the doors still closed. Notice the wood plank holding it shut. This one is just being opened and you can barely see the bodies spilling out, and this one is completely open. The bodies were then taken out and thrown into large pits and covered over with dirt when the pits were full. Let's look at a map rather than a model for a moment. We can see the path to the gas chamber. Here's the gas chamber. And here's all the pits where at Treblinka alone an estimated 700,000 bodies were buried. When the killing operation was nearly finished and the bodies lie decaying in mass graves, Heinrich Himmler ordered the camps to dig up the bodies and cremate them. The reason for this was that Germany was losing the war, and this territory in Poland would be taken over by the Soviets. Himmler didn't want the Soviets to find the mass graves. So at the 3 camps, 1.3 million bodies were dug up. During the very end of the killing operations, the bodies were taken directly to the cremation grills. To summarize what we've just learned, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belsec were all run in the same way. At Treblinka alone, an estimated 700,000 were gassed, buried, later they were dug up and then cremated. 50,000 were gassed and then taken directly to be cremated, for a total of 750,000. At all 3 camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belsec, an estimated 1.3 million were gassed, buried, dug up, then cremated, with an estimated 200,000 gassed and then cremated. Total deaths were 1.5 million, nearly 1/3 of the whole Holocaust. At the bottom of most every page in Hilberg there are sources or footnotes. They are in text slightly smaller than the book's text. It's what Hilberg read in order to then write his book. What would happen if we looked at some of these sources? We're going to look at number 63. Yankel Wernick is the author, and his book is called 1 Year in Treblinka. Where can we find this book? Amazon.com doesn't have it. Neither does San Francisco Public Library or San Francisco State University Library. Here on Amazon, no one has ever even reviewed it. It turns out a copy does exist at the University of California at Berkeley. It says, an inmate who escaped tells the day-to-day facts of 1 year of his torturous experience. So finally we get to hear about the Holocaust from someone who was really there. Most Jews who arrived at Treblinka died within the hour. However, a certain number were forced to live there and help with the killing operations. Wernick was one of those until he escaped. Let's see what it says about the process of burning the bodies. Wernick writes, again the corpses of oldsters, children, women, and men were exhumed. Whenever a grave was opened, a terrible stench polluted the air, as the bodies were in an advanced stage of putrefaction. It turned out that women burned easier than men. Accordingly, corpses of women were used for kindling the fires. But wait a minute, that sounds odd. Does Wernick actually believe that women burn on their own? Like wood? That was page 28, but here on page 29 he essentially says as much. They had to pile the corpses on the grating and set them on fire. 3,000 corpses recently alive burning all at once. But here at a given signal they set the giant torch on fire and it burned with a huge flame. There's no wood mentioned, there's piles of bodies. He's saying that the bodies themselves burned like a giant torch. And on page 39 he writes, once the Germans threw some burning object into an open grave to see what would happen. Clouds of black smoke began to pour out at once, and the fire that started glimmered all day long. In other words, the bodies underground ignited. On the very last page he writes about his escape. He was shot in the shoulder by a Ukrainian guard at close distance. Regarding the bullet, he writes, believe it or not, the bullet did not wound me. It went through all of my clothing and stopped at my shoulder, leaving a mark. He killed the guard with an axe, by the way. Back on page 29, there is a description of the Germans as they burned bodies. Ask yourself if it looks like propaganda or a real eyewitness account. The Germans stood around with satanic smiles on their faces, radiating satisfaction over their foul deeds. They drank toasts with choice liquors, ate, caroused, and enjoyed themselves near the warm fire. Seems a little over the top, doesn't it? Could German soldiers drink while on duty? Could you imagine having an appetite if you were surrounded by thousands of pounds of rotting flesh? Imagine what it would have smelled like there. Would the Germans have really had that demeanor? He later writes, the German fiends stood warming themselves, drinking, eating, and singing. At last the fires died down, leaving nothing but ashes. He seems to forget that they'd also leave bones. But anyway. Wernick's vilifying portrayals weren't restricted only to the Nazis. Of a Jewish inmate, he writes on page 37, another such poor wretch was the so-called privy pit boss, Scheissmeister. He was dressed like a cantor and even had to grow a pointed beard. He wore a large alarm clock on a string around his neck. As no one was permitted to remain in the privy pit longer than 3 minutes, it was his duty to time everyone entering it. The name of this poor wretch was Julian. He also came from Czestochowa, where he had been the owner of a metal products factory. Would the German soldiers really have done something this ridiculously theatrical? And owner of a metal products factory. Consider. This book was published by the American representation of the General Jewish Workers' Union of Poland. And on page 12 Wernick writes, I am a carpenter by trade, but for many years I functioned as a member of the examining board of the Warsaw Trades Chamber. So Wernick had apparently worked for a union, and this book was published by a union. It's likely that the hapless Julian in real life was an infamous factory owner who had had a dispute with the union, and was thus portrayed this way in the book. It's clear that this 46-page book, A Year in Treblinka, is a fraud. But how could Wernick have made the mistakes he made? In other words, why couldn't he lie very well? How could somebody not know that bodies don't burn on their own? that bullets that penetrate the clothing aren't likely to stop at the skin. For one, Wernick was born long ago, 1891. At that time, Poland might not have been as modernized as Germany, the United States, or England. Then there's Polish Yiddish culture. Perhaps it wasn't in some ways as modernized as, say, German Yiddish culture. Perhaps it was very urban, and thus Wernick didn't know a lot about the country. So we went into the foundations of the Treblinka death camp story by looking up a source in Raoul Hilberg's The Destruction of the European Jews, and we found Yankel Wernick's book, A Year in Treblinka, but it turned out to be a fraud. Hilberg cites it as a source 5 times, by the way. But maybe other Holocaust scholars are more discerning. Let's take Yitzhak Arad. He was the head of Israel's Holocaust Museum, which is called Yad Vashem. This position is likely the most important Holocaust position in the world. He wrote a book called Belsec, Sobibor, Treblinka, the Operation Reinhard death camps. In addition, he was also a brigadier general in the Israeli army, so he would know about guns, fires, etc. So would he use Wernick's book as a source? The answer is yes. Not only does he use Wernick's book as a source, but mentions him by name on 24 pages. Arad puts his sources in the back of the book instead of at the bottom of each page like Hilberg. Here is just a single page of his sources. Wernick, 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 Wernick. Wernick, 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 and Wernick. Here's a map of Treblinka on page 39 in Arad's book. Here's the end of the tube. Here's the gas chamber. And here are the burial pits. The problem is that there is a water well right here, as you can see on the legend below. The burial pits surround it. That is 700,000 people buried and decaying. At 100 pounds per person, that's 70 million pounds of rotting flesh surrounding this well. The well would have been contaminated. Yet on the day of the inmate escape, they mention fetching water here, as can be seen on page 289 of Arad's book, and on page 292. Granted, the claim is that they had been removing the bodies from the pits, but bodies were still there. We see that on page 280, where Arad writes, "During the second half of July, work in the extermination area was close to termination." A sentence later he writes, "More than 3/4 of the burial pits in the camp had been opened and the corpses extracted and cremated. But 3/4 of 700,000 means that there were 175,000 bodies left just 2 weeks before the supposed August 2nd, 1943 uprising. Plus, on the day of the escape," Arad writes on page 288, "the prisoners employed at removing the bodies from the last ditches worked particularly hard that day, so that the number of bodies they brought to the grills was far greater than that morning's cremation capacity. So we know there were lots of bodies all the way up to the last day." Yet we see that getting water from this well was a regular occurrence. On page 289, the former longtime director of Israel's Holocaust Museum, Yitzhak Arad, writes, "Every afternoon, 2 or 3 prisoners would be allowed out of the barracks area to the well, some 20 meters from the gate in the barracks fence, to fetch water for the barracks kitchen, for preparing supper and washing dishes." Here's the Jewish prisoners' barracks area highlighted in green. Here's the fence. And we see the well some 20 meters away, or 65 feet. Thus we saw the barracks area and the well, which is some 20 meters away from the gate in the barracks fence. On the day of the escape, Arad writes, "The work of carrying the water was executed slowly that day, and the quantity of water brought to the kitchen was greater than usual." Again, we need to think of the historical demographic of the storytellers. Similar to Yankel Wernick, they were urban, with likely having little formal education. Water wells being largely a rural thing, they had no idea there was a conflict between the mass burial of millions of pounds of bodies and a water well in the middle of that.
We had scissors from them. We took benches of hair, cut off, threw on the floor to the side. In about 2 minutes, has to be finished. Not even 2 minutes. Because there was a line waiting to come up the next week. And that's how we worked.
Except that's not how it would have worked. If you're going to get off the train and get gassed within the hour and then thrown into a pit, what is the point of a haircut? Here's a photo of a model of Treblinka. So the train comes in here. The people get out here, come into this courtyard, go through this fence. The men go to this side stripped naked, walk over here. The women go to this side stripped naked. Then they go through this path called the tube to the gas chambers here, where they're gassed, killed, and thrown into the outlying pits. Somewhere between the train and the pits for the women, there's a haircut, and that makes no sense. The Germans did shave heads as a life-saving measure to prevent the spread of lice-infected typhus. People like Bomba and Wernick didn't understand that, so they include it in their Treblinka stories. Wernick and Bomba were likely shipped east where they had seen the Germans cutting the hair. So it's included in their stories about Treblinka, but in a way that makes no sense because they didn't understand it. At the Nuremberg trials, there was only one inmate eyewitness representing 1/3 of the Holocaust. One inmate eyewitness for 1.5 million people. And look how believable his testimony is. His name was Samuel Rosman and claimed to have been at Treblinka. When on the stand at the Nuremberg trials, he was asked why they cut off the women's hair. His reply, "According to the ideas of the masters, this hair was to be used in the manufacture of mattresses for German women." That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? No men allowed on these mattresses. The judge never even questioned him about it, nor were any human hair mattresses ever found. On page 878, Raoul Hilberg writes, "Later, all three camps, Sobibor and Treblinka from the start, were equipped with diesel motors. A German who briefly served at Sobibor recalls a 200 horsepower 8-cylinder engine of a captured Soviet tank, which released a mixture of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide into the gas chambers." And in Yitzhak Arad's book, on page 42, Arad writes regarding Sobibor, "A room attached to the building contained a diesel engine, which introduced the poisonous carbon monoxide gas through pipes into the chambers." The problem with this story is that there is hardly any carbon monoxide in diesel exhaust. Diesel exhaust is largely particulate in the form of black soot. There's also a lot of air that goes into the engine but doesn't react, and then goes out the exhaust pipe as air. So mixed into that black soot is oxygen. And the problem with a regular engine, not a diesel, is that although it produces some carbon monoxide as a waste product to the combustion process, why assume it's the best way to produce carbon monoxide? What you're looking at is the best way to make a car move forward, but not the best way to make carbon monoxide. Similarly, take these two air conditioners. When on, they cool the air and as a byproduct produce some water droplets via condensation. But would they be the best way to produce water? Creating carbon monoxide is a simple chemical reaction. A stream of air passes through a closed bucket of hot coals. The heat makes the oxygen molecules break into individual oxygen atoms. Carbon atoms from the hot coals then bond with the oxygen atoms to make carbon monoxide gas. and carbon monoxide gas in high concentrations is flammable. Here, some innovative people show how simple the process is with items found lying around the backyard. They've taken an old water heater, added some pipes, and to shield the flame topped it off with a bucket to create a carbon monoxide gas generator. Then they get a lighter and light the gas to prove it's working. The carbon monoxide gas is called wood gas or producer gas. Here is a wood gas generator mounted on a trailer. The canister is filled with wood chip coals. In this video, we're looking at the black canister on the right. The white water heater is actually resting against the barn. Producing carbon monoxide is a simple process. You don't need all this. And a wood gas generator can produce carbon monoxide in much higher concentrations than this engine. And the Germans would have known that. Here's a list of the Nobel Prize winners in chemistry in the roughly 20 years before the beginning of the war. Here are the Americans, and here are the Germans. Plus, there were 500,000 of these wood gas generators all over Europe during World War II, mounted on trucks and cars because there was a gasoline shortage and civilian vehicles were being converted to run on wood gas. A search on the web shows that there are a few people that still use these wood gas generators today. They have to be careful though, because these wood gas generators produce carbon monoxide at around 3 times the concentration of regular gasoline engine exhaust and around 100 times more than diesel exhaust. So when we look at Hilberg on page 878 and see that the poison gas was carbon monoxide coming from a diesel motor, we can see how absurd that is. But even more absurd considering that the engine came from a captured Soviet tank where they'd have no access to an engine manual in German and no easy access to spare parts for an engine with such a critical task. The storytellers assumed that the biggest, smelliest engine would be the one that produced the most deadly gas, but the Germans would have used a wood gas generator. One last thing about carbon monoxide gas. A regular fire produces carbon monoxide gas as well, but it burns up in the fire itself, thus creating the flame of the fire. To do this, the carbon monoxide reacts with more oxygen. With wood gas generators, the carbon monoxide gas is drawn off the coals so it can't react with more oxygen until later. For more information, try a search like this. SFSU Magazine is a twice-yearly publication of San Francisco State University for its alumni, faculty, staff, students, donors, and friends. In this issue, there is a story about how a complete set of the Nuremberg transcripts were donated to the Jewish Studies Department. Professor Mark Dollinger was sitting at his office desk, thoroughly absorbed in preparing lecture notes for his next class, when he got a telephone call that almost made him fall out of his chair. "Yes, yes, yes," Dollinger shouted into the phone. "Where can I drive right now to pick them up?" Educated Americans nearly unanimously believe that the Nuremberg trials thoroughly documented Holocaust crimes. Professor Dollinger articulates this view. This is the most detailed chronology we have of the Nazi atrocities, tens of thousands of pages of personal history. It's a very complete picture of the most horrific moment in modern Jewish history. But would you believe that for the 218-day trial of over 1,000 hours, Treblinka, Belsec, and Sobibor were discussed for only around 20 minutes? We leave San Francisco State University and go to the University of California at Berkeley. Here are the 42 volumes of the 10-month trial known as the Trial of the Major War Criminals by the International Military Tribunal. It doesn't look like a book set because many of the book's spines have been replaced. The first 22 volumes is the court transcript, and the other 20 volumes are submitted documents. But the tribunal ruled that no submitted documents would be considered evidence unless they were read into the transcript. These 22 volumes have been put on the web by Yale University Law School through a program called the Avalon Project. Here's the 22 volumes. I found that the search engine built into the site doesn't work, so we use Google to search it. We put in Avalon Project as this appears as text on every web page, and this limits the search to Yale University. We then type in the name of one of the 3 camps, starting with Belsec, the alleged site of 600,000 deaths, and we get one hit in volume 12. The one below this is a duplicate. With Command F for Macintosh computers or Control F for Windows computers, we find where the word occurs. The context of this passage is that a member of the British prosecution team, Lieutenant Colonel Griffith Jones, is confronting one of the Germans on trial, Julius Streicher. The English prosecutor is alleging that Streicher knew about the Holocaust during the war via foreign publications, which he must have read, and indeed had subscriptions to. Julius Streicher keeps replying that if he had read the reports, he wouldn't have believed them. Referring to a publication called Israelitisches Wochenblatt, the English prosecutor says, many details are also given about the use of poison gas as at Chelm, of electricity in Belsec, of the deportations from Warsaw, the surrounding of blocks of houses, and of the attacks with machine guns. We're interested in the phrase, of electricity in Belsec. What does that mean? In answering that, we find that Carlo Matono, in his book Belsec, tells us of another reference to the Belsec camp, where Belsec is mistakenly referred to as Camp Belsen. We find the reference and learn about the electricity at Belsec. The Soviet prosecutor Lev Smirnov is reading from the official report on German crimes in Poland. Smirnov says, in this same report in the last paragraph on page 136 of the document book, we may read that Camp Belsen was founded in 1940, but it was in 1942 that the special electrical appliances were built in for mass extermination of people. Under the pretext that the people were being led to the bathhouse, the doomed were undressed and then driven to the building where the floor was electrified in a special way. There they were killed. And that's all there is for Belsec at the Nuremberg trial. A description of an electric floor that gets an A+ for diabolical content, but a 0 for truthfulness. Julius Streicher, by the way, was sentenced to death because he published a magazine that said really mean things about Jews. Now we look to see what was said about Sobibor. We get one hit here. The hit below this is a duplicate. But this is not the International Military Tribunal. This is a later American trial, and Sobibor is mentioned only when listing the other camps. But again, with the help of Carlo Matono's book, we find that Sobibor was mentioned once at the big Nuremberg trial, but spelled as Sobibor, the misspelling being closer to how it's pronounced. It occurs where Camp Belsen was mentioned. It says that Camp Sobibor was founded during the first and second liquidation of the Jewish ghetto, but the extermination on a large scale in this camp really started at the beginning of 1943. And that's all there is for Sobibor in this 10-month-long trial. We now go to Treblinka and get 57 hits, many of which are duplicates and many which mention Treblinka only in passing. On February 25th, we see that the Soviet prosecutor reads an account of a Treblinka survivor named Jacob Vernick. Before I read it, let's try to picture the setting in the courtroom. We read at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum website that in addition to the legal teams and judges, over 400 visitors attended the proceedings each day, as well as 325 correspondents representing 23 different countries. And as this account is read from a Treblinka survivor named Jacob Vernick, be aware of the high-level caliber of this trial, with people like Chief U.S. Prosecutor Robert Jackson, handpicked by the President of the United States. Imagine all the Germans on trial listening, and imagine the hushed courtroom as Soviet prosecutor Lev Smirnov leans into the microphone and says, "This is what Wernicke said in presenting a report on Treblinka to the Polish government, a report which, as he stressed in his foreword, was his only reason to continue his pitiful life. Awake or asleep, I see terrible visions of thousands of people calling for help, begging for life and mercy. I have lost my family. I have myself led them to death. I have myself built the death chambers in which they were murdered. I am afraid of everything. I fear that everything I have seen is written on my face. An old and broken life is a heavy burden, but I must carry on and live to tell the world what German crimes and barbarism I saw. The problem is that Jacob Wernicke is Yankel Wernicke. It's just another way to spell and pronounce his name. He is the guy that wrote A Year in Treblinka, where he said a man with a pointy beard and an alarm clock around his neck timed people going to the bathroom, who said that a bullet went through his clothes but didn't pierce his skin. The guard who shot him he valiantly killed with the swing of an axe. Everyone in this solemn courtroom is listening to a passage from Yankel Wernicke's book. For Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belsec, the only survivor to testify in person was Samuel Rosman. He testified on the witness stand for around 15 minutes. We're going to read part of the Nuremberg transcript, but first let me explain what the term "the president" means here. There were 4 judges, one for the USA, Soviet Union, France, and England. Each had equal voting power, but the English judge, Geoffrey Lawrence, was chosen as the presiding judge, hence president. He controlled the daily operations in the courtroom. Soon after Samuel Rosman begins testifying, there is this exchange. The Soviet prosecutor says to Rosman, "I would like you to tell the tribunal what the Germans called the street to the gas chambers." It was named Himmelfahrt Street. That is to say, the street to heaven? Yes. If it interests the court, I can present a plan of the camp of Treblinka, which I drew up when I was there, and I can point out to the tribunal this street on the plan. I do not think it is necessary to put in a plan of the camp, unless you particularly want to. Yes, I also believe that that is not really necessary. Can you believe that? The only Jewish alleged eyewitness appearing in person representing nearly 1/3 of the Holocaust tries to present a map. But the presiding judge and the Soviet prosecutor team up to dissuade him from doing so. For the Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belsec camps, the court went mapless, as this was the only map ever offered into evidence. A minute later, Soviet prosecutor Smirnov asks, "Why was their hair cut off?" According to the ideas of the masters, this hair was to be used in the manufacture of mattresses for German women. Right. It had nothing to do with lice, which carried the disease typhus. It was all about human hair mattress stuffing. Rosman even begins lying the minute he hits the witness stand. Here he reads his oath to tell the truth, and then he says, "In August 1942, I was taken away from the Warsaw Ghetto." But at the University of California, Berkeley, we find an article Rosman wrote that was included in a United States House of Representatives hearing transcript. Rosman writes on page 121 that on September 17th he was taken to the train and deported. But at Nuremberg, a year later, he says he was deported in August. It's likely he changed his story after realizing that his September 17th date didn't fit with Warsaw deportation train records, as seen here in Yitzhak Arad's book. Holocaust deniers also believe Jews were deported on these trains, but to camps, not death camps. While we're on this paragraph, notice that he mentions that 90 people were crowded into one cattle car. The idea being the cruelty of treating human beings like cattle. But then he says, in our car, 5 women and 2 men had suffocated. The problem is that if you go to any hobby shop and look at models of cattle cars, you'll see that cattle cars have slats. You can't suffocate in one. Rosman was trying to put various propaganda rumors into his own story and mistakenly combined cattle cars with suffocation. On page 122 of the House of Representatives document, Rosman's article states that people were put into cabins with room for 700 to 800 persons. They were then killed by pumping the air out with a machine. Rosman wrote a number of articles like this, which contradicted the established Treblinka story. Due to that, the Soviet prosecutor didn't want his map and was careful not to ask Rosman to go into details about the gas chambers. Instead, Soviet prosecutor Lev Smirnov sets him up to tell a baby-killing story. Perhaps, witness, you can describe this lazarette to the tribunal. This was part of a square which was closed in with a wooden fence. All women, aged persons, and sick children were driven there. At the gates of this lazarette, there was a large red cross flag. Men's, who specialized in the murder of all persons brought to this lazarette, would not let anybody else do this job. There might have been hundreds of persons who wanted to see and know what was in store for them being the Jews. But he insisted on carrying out this work by himself. Here is just one example of what was the fate of the children there. A 10-year-old girl was brought to this building from the train with her 2-year-old sister. When the elder girl saw that Menz had taken out a revolver to shoot her 2-year-old sister, she threw herself upon him, crying out and asking why he wanted to kill her. He did not kill the little sister. He threw her alive into the oven and then killed the elder sister. Rosman likely meant to say he did not shoot the little sister, he threw her alive into the oven and then shot the elder sister. But how could he know this story? He just said that Menz would not let anybody do this job. He insisted on carrying out this work by himself, and Samuel Rosman didn't work in the lazarette. He couldn't have seen it himself. Rosman either made it up or heard it from someone else. If he heard it from somebody else, then in legal terms, that's called hearsay evidence and is generally not allowed in a court of law. And yet the presiding judge allows him to tell his hearsay story. Also, in the established Treblinka story, the lazarette has a fire pit, not an oven. The lazarette is the place they would take you if you were too weak to walk all the way to the gas chambers after your 50-mile train ride from Warsaw, according to the story. Keep in mind that the Germans are accused of being baby killers. We happen to be on February 27th, 1946, because that's the day Samuel Rosman testified. But while here, let's do a keyword search on BAB to pick up the word baby and babies. And we see an example of another alleged eyewitness describing a German soldier killing a baby and laughing. And if we do a search on children, we see where Soviet prosecutor Lev Smirnov asks yet another alleged witness from Auschwitz the following. Tell me, please, witness, were you an eyewitness of German SS men's attitude toward children? She replies, yes. After many questions, Smirnov asks, were they thrown into the ovens alive or were they killed by other means before they were burned? The children were thrown in alive. But consider that Raoul Hilberg doesn't mention children being thrown alive into fires in his 3-volume The Destruction of the European Jews, and neither does the Auschwitz entry at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. In other words, even Holocaust historians don't believe that happened. Considering that, notice how the lawyers supposedly representing the Germans always waive their right to cross-examine these alleged witnesses. A good lawyer could have exposed all the lies I've pointed out. Yet here's an example of what I've always found when I've read the transcript. The witness accusing the Germans of killing babies by throwing them alive into a fire finishes testifying, and the president asks, do any of the defendants' counsel wish to ask any questions? There was no response. And the judge continues, then the witness can retire. At the end of Rosman's article in the U.S. House of Representatives document, He mentions how many people were killed at Treblinka. First, take note that in Raoul Hilberg's book, The Destruction of the European Jews, Hilberg estimates the number killed at Treblinka as up to 750,000. Samuel Rosman, however, has a much higher number. The number of Jews were, from Germany about 120,000, from Austria 40,000, from Poland 1.5 million, from Czechoslovakia 100,000, from Bulgaria 14,000, from Russia 1 million, total 2,774,000. Someone is off by 2 million, either Raoul Hilberg or Samuel Rosman, but this, and the pumping air out of the chamber, and suffocating in a cattle car, and 800 people per bedroom-sized chamber, doesn't keep Hilberg from using Rosman's article as a source. Hilberg writes in his book, The Destruction of the European Jews, that when Jews arrived at Treblinka, some suffered nervous shock, laughing and crying alternately. And the little 61 here on page 972 is the source. It is Rosman's article that we've been looking at. Hilberg's modus operandi seems to be this: if you can find a believable paragraph in an otherwise fraudulent article, use it. There was one other person who made substantial comments about Treblinka at the Nuremberg trial. He was the head of the Auschwitz concentration camp. His name was Rudolf Höss. His testimony was of course mainly about Auschwitz, but he said some things about Treblinka as well. When he testified, there were two people in the courtroom with similar names, Rudolf Höss and a Rudolf Hess. Both names have multiple spellings. Let's clarify for a moment who each one is. Rudolf Hess was at one time the second in command in Nazi Germany, just under Adolf Hitler. In 1941, Hess did something very crazy. In a desperate attempt to keep Western Europe from being plunged into war, he piloted a plane by himself to England in an attempt to go around Winston Churchill and make contact with England's peace factions. When the plane was flying over England, he got out of the pilot's seat, put on a parachute for the first time in his life, and jumped out of the plane. Spraining his ankle upon landing in a field, he was caught and promptly arrested. After the war, the English sent him to Nuremberg to be tried as a major war criminal. He was sentenced to life in prison and spent the next 40 years in the strangely cruel environment of Spandau prison where, for instance, guards were instructed to never call him by his actual name. He was never allowed to hug or touch his son ever again, nor was he ever allowed a single moment alone with him. Hess died at 92 years old after 40 years in that environment. Rudolf Höss is the one we are looking at, though. He was the camp commander of Auschwitz. While at the prison in Nuremberg, Höss signed a confession, and when he was on the witness stand, his confession was read to him by American Assistant Prosecutor Colonel John Amon. Amon was a prosecutor, but he had another position at Nuremberg as well. He was the head of interrogations. After Höss appeared at Nuremberg as a witness, he was then turned over to the Polish government and executed a year later. So picture this moment at the Nuremberg trial. Höss is on the witness stand listening to the head of interrogations, Colonel Amon, read his own confession to him. Colonel Amon says, "I commanded Auschwitz until 1st of December 1943 and estimate that at least 2,500,000 victims were executed and exterminated there by gassing and burning, and at least another 500,000 succumbed to starvation and disease, making a total dead of about 3 million. Colonel Amon reads some more of the confession and then says, "That is all true, witness?" "Yes, it is." The problem is that if we go to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum website and look up Auschwitz, it states, "It is estimated that the SS and police deported at a minimum 1.3 million people to Auschwitz complex between 1940 and 1945. Of these, the camp authorities murdered 1.1 million. And when they say murdered, they are including the disease and starvation deaths. So the Auschwitz Museum website says 1.1 million were killed, and yet Höss confessed to 3 million. Strange that he would do that, isn't it? For the next passage in the Nuremberg transcript, we need to know what the term general government here means. It was an area of Poland occupied by Germany. We look at what Hus said about Treblinka. Colonel Amen continues reading the confession. The final solution of the Jewish question meant the complete extermination of all Jews in Europe. I was ordered to establish extermination facilities at Auschwitz in June 1941. At that time, there were already in the general government 3 other extermination camps, Belsec, Treblinka, and Wolzek. Hus has thrown out a fake name, Wolzek, a city that doesn't exist. He puts it in the place of Sobibor. It was likely an intentional mistake. Hus knew that the interrogators didn't know enough about the subject to call him on it. Notice that Hus says that in June 1941, there were already in the general government 3 other extermination camps. But if we look at Yitzhak Arad's book, we see that they hadn't even started building any of the camps at that time. On page 24, we read when they began the first camp, Belsec. The construction of the death camp began on November 1st, 1941. You can pause the video and look at them side by side. Then the confession states, I visited Treblinka to find out how they carried out their exterminations. The camp commandant at Treblinka told me that he had liquidated 80,000 in the course of 1/2 year. He was principally concerned with liquidating all the Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto. He used monoxide gas, and I did not think that his methods were very efficient. So when I set up the extermination building at Auschwitz, I used Cyclone B, which was a crystallized prussic acid, which we dropped into the death chamber from a small opening. But let me paraphrase and expound on what he just said. He basically said, Treblinka was using a gas that wasn't really that deadly, so I decided to use a deadly gas instead. Can you imagine the Germans using 2 totally different gases for the same job? One you take a whiff of and have cyanide in your lungs, and the other you take a whiff of on any busy street. Back to Hus' confession read by Colonel Amen. Another improvement we made over Treblinka was that we built our gas chamber to accommodate 2,000 people at one time, whereas at Treblinka their 10 chambers only accommodated 200 people each. But that's like saying this. The Treblinka people didn't seem to have their thinking caps on when they combined millions of deaths and bedroom-sized chambers, so I put big chambers. The confession later says, still another improvement we made over Treblinka was that at Treblinka the victims almost always knew they were going to be exterminated, and at Auschwitz we endeavored to fool the victims into thinking that they were going to go through a delousing process. Not only is that not true according to the established story, but it's like saying this. Treblinka would never believe this, but people are way more willing to step into what they think is a shower as opposed to what they think is a gas chamber. And that's all that Hus said about Treblinka. So we've seen what was said about nearly 1/3 of the Holocaust at Nuremberg. Not much. Around 20 minutes were spent, and here's a breakdown of that. That it was only 20 minutes is shocking enough, but even more shocking is how many lies were packed into that 20 minutes. We read what Professor Mark Dollinger said again, and we see that for around 1/3 of the Holocaust at least, what he says isn't true at all. This article can be found on the web here. This is the most detailed chronology we have of the Nazi atrocities, tens of thousands of pages of personal history. It's a very complete picture of the most horrific moment in modern Jewish history. You know, when I first bought this tape at 17, I couldn't really relate to the title because power, corruption, and lies weren't really part of my world. I feel for any team that has to bear the burden. This realization. It's important to remember it's not about fighting, it's about joy and love and putting forth good energy.
That's it, a wrap. That's all the time we have. This is the John Savers Variety Spotlight Show. My name is John Savers. I'm your host. I certainly appreciate your tuning in. Hope to see you again next